This program is brought to you in part by SalCal Real Estate Connections. Yes, and welcome back to the Telescope View. As promised, we have our guest, Rick Teles, and of course our compadre, Steve Parker, the icon from the radio, I'd like to call him.
I like compadre better.
Okay, you like that better? Okay. Now, as promised you, we told you we were going to get into the very first event we'll be covering, the Roswell incident, and we're going to let Rick talk about that incident as it unfolded back in 1947. Okay, Rick?
Okay, well, I think a lot of people have heard about the Roswell UFO crash. That happened in July of 1947 in Roswell, New Mexico. And that kind of marks what we call the beginning of the modern era of the UFO phenomenon. According to the reports, and this is all fact, this all happened, that in 1947, something crashed in the desert of Roswell, New Mexico. The debris was found by a rancher by the name of Mac Brazel, and he brought it into the local sheriff, and the sheriff then had him go to Roswell Army Airfield because he thought that's something that they should see. So he brought it to Roswell Army Airfield, and at the time he saw somebody by the name of Major Jesse Marcel, who was the head of base intelligence for the 509th Bombardment Group, and that's important. We'll talk about that in a minute. He went out to the site and he found some debris that he described as a debris of not of this world. And shortly after that, a press release was issued by Roswell Army Airfield, the base, under the approval of the base commander, Colonel Butch Blanchard, that said the United States Army had found the remains of a crashed flying disc, a crashed flying saucer, and that went worldwide.
It was headline.
It was headlines across the world. The interesting thing is that happened again in 1947. There's been a lot of stories, there's been a lot of discussion about it, and to this day, it still captures people's imagination. Why? Why does a story like that continue to capture people's imagination? I think that's what we're going to talk a little bit about.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the things we would like to know, and we've talked a few times with Rick. What was it about your background? I know you can only go so far into it, but what kind of background do you have that led you to this point?
Well, as we mentioned in the beginning, I have a background in cybersecurity, cyber warfare type of stuff, which led me to work for the government, aerospace industry, and the Air Force, where I was involved with people who had information about all of this. These were people, high-level, high-ranking military intelligence officers who had access to this information, and like we said, was probably the biggest secret in the history of mankind.
And Rick, of course, is an author. You've got a book out now too, right?
Yes, right.
Yes, we talked about that, and when we introduced Rick, that he is the author of The Final Revelation with the Sun Project, and believe me, that is a very interesting reading. And Rick, so tell me now, what this is what went on that particular day, but who else were the players involved here?
There was a lot of players involved. And the interesting thing about this is really little was known about it, except for some of the people who were involved until 1978. When Jesse Marcel, who then was Major Marcel at the time, and we should mention who retired from the Army Air Corps, which became the Air Force, as a colonel, lieutenant colonel. That's going to be important too. He started talking about this in 1978, and when he started talking about this, a number of people wrote a book, Crash at Corona. People started to stand up, and there was a few other people who were with him at the base that said, yeah, this actually happened. And of course the government said, no, this didn't, okay? What the story was is back in 1948 is we found a flying disc. No, we didn't. We found a crashed weather balloon. So what happened is very quickly that story was retracted, and the story about a weather balloon was put out there. And we had a number of players involved. One was, at the time, Major Jesse Marcel, who was the base intelligence officer for the 509th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Corps. Now, what's interesting about the 509th is they're the ones who bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were the only nuclear force in the world at this time. So the men who are part of this, or commanders of this, should be pretty sharp people. Would we not agree about that?
Oh, absolutely.
So he was the base intelligence officer, which means that he would have access to all types of intelligence information. He would have known about the Manhattan Project. He would now know about any secret stuff that's going on. Well, his commander was a guy by the name of Colonel Butch Blanchard. Okay, also, he was the commander of the 509. Again, should be a pretty sharp officer at this point. He's the one who reviewed Marcel's information and gave him permission to have another person write up the press release and send it out. So I went through both these men. There's also a group called the Counterintelligence Corps, who back then was kind of a very secret group. And the Counterintelligence Corps scared a lot of people. Their tactics were, you don't talk about it. Or and they said, in fact, to some people about this, they'll find your bones in the desert if you talk about this. All right. So these people were involved. The sheriff of Roswell was involved. Also involved was Marcel's son, who was about 11 years old at the time. What happened was Marcel went out to the desert. He found this debris. And the rancher, Brazel, told him, the funny thing is that this field is about 300 feet long by 100 feet wide. And the ranch was a sheep ranch. And the sheep would not cross the debris field. For no reason would they go past that debris field. So Brazel picked up some of the stuff. He put it in the barn. Some they said was like an aluminum or a metal. The interesting thing about the metal is what we know today as a memory metal, which we do have today, but we didn't have in 47, where the memory metal was, in fact, you could roll it up and then let it go, it would unroll itself. There'd be no creases. Stories were told that they tested this, they'd hit it with hammers, and they couldn't dent it. Marcel gathered up some of this information. On his way back to the base, he stopped by the house because he wanted to show his wife and his son. And he showed them pieces of this debris. He said, I want you to see this because this is from something not of this world. I want you to know because when the story comes out, I want you to be aware of it. So Jesse Marcel Jr. recounted this story many times, and I think many people have heard that. And Jesse Marcel Jr. actually kept a few of the pieces. Well, when the story was retracted, he had to go back. Marcel Sr. had to go back and take that away from his son, who was not happy about that. And he told that story many, many times. So those are the basic players. Then there was General Ramey, who was head of the Air Force in the area, the wings in the area, out of Fort Worth, Texas. And he's the one who said, kill this story. Well, long story short, what happened is in the end, there's a now famous photograph of Jesse Marcel being photographed with what he's showing as a weather balloon and with the reflector from the weather balloon. The weather balloon had reflectors and they were made of tin foil. And what we actually have right here is an example of a weather balloon. Now this is a small one because I wasn't going to do a 4-foot one. But they looked very much like this, and you'll see photographs of it. And they were made with a tin foil at the time. I remember as kids we talked about tin foil. It was. Yeah. Then we went to aluminum foil. But it was made of aluminum foil, and they used wooden sticks to create it. And this would be attached, and there might be multiple ones, to a weather balloon. And the weather balloons that they used at the time was one of these. This is an actual weather balloon.
Weather balloon. Yeah.
Okay? And this would inflate it will be about 4 to 5 feet. This is before they used the giant 200-foot weather balloons. But this is,
excuse me, how old is this?
This is from the 50s. Actually.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, this is an old weather balloon.
This is the real deal.
This is the real deal. Okay.
And how big would that be when you blew it?
This one would be 4 to 5 feet. But there could be multiple ones on a string here of radar reflectors.
Okay.
There could be multiple ones. So these are stuff that, you know, when the story came out, they said this is what it was. It was a weather balloon. Okay? And there was a number of other things that they talked about. This particular piece here is a radio sonde. What this does, this is from the 40s. This measures altitude and temperatures on a weather balloon. And it's interesting that in the reports when they came out, nobody mentioned ever finding a radio sonde, which is kind of interesting. But this is the very real thing, and somebody would have spotted this right away. So those are basically the players that we have right now, and there's a few others. But there's been a lot of stories about Roswell, a lot of people involved. But what we want to do is focus on some of the questions that were never answered about Roswell. In '95, the General Accounting Office in the Air Force came out with a report, the definitive report, what happened at Roswell. And actually, there were 2 reports. The first one came out and said, yeah, it was a weather balloon. Then they kind of went back and said, no, we weren't really being straight with you. It was a Project Mogul balloon. Okay.
Project
Mogul.
Okay, okay.
So, what's Project Mogul?
Exactly.
Project Mogul was a project that went on in the late 40s and through the 50s, maybe even longer than that. But as we got the U-2 spy plane, probably changed. Project Mogul had a series of these reflectors hooked to weather balloons, plus some other instrumentation like a radio sound. The purpose of Project Mogul, it was a nuclear testing monitoring device. We wanted to know if the Soviet Union at that time was testing nuclear weapons. And we could do that by putting these balloons high in the air and gathering information from the wind that passed from, from Central Asia back to this country. So they're saying it was a Project Mogul balloon. All right. Now, the interesting thing about these balloons are, these were launched almost daily from Roswell Army Airfield for weather, and launched in the city of Roswell from the top of buildings by researchers.
Very common occurrence.
Very common.
Okay.
Okay, so as we look at these, and I talked to each one of you, is if I put this, and I gave this to you, Steve, and I said, what do you think this is? Is that a flying saucer? And what would you say?
No, I don't think that's a flying saucer.
Have you ever been in the military?
No.
Are you a base intelligence officer?
Well, I really can't say. I mean,
Okay.
no, I'm not, no.
Larry, what do you think that is?
I have no idea. It looks like, I don't know what it
It's
is.
kind of like a vegetable or
Well,
squash.
it's certainly- certainly not-
If you look
it's
at the end,
certain-
it's really kind of odd.
Yeah, it's not a flying saucer.
What about this? What does this look like to you?
Piece of wood.
It looks like a piece of wood, doesn't it? Oh, okay. And this,
Tin foil.
it looks like something maybe the kids made, some kind of weird kite.
You're really doing well so far.
Okay, yeah,
Now,
you're doing 100% here, okay? So that's part of the problem.
so that device you just showed us, that tin foil, in reality was about 4 feet square.
About 4 feet, about 4
Yeah.
feet long, 4 to 5 feet.
Okay.
So,
And that would be attached to this?
it would be attached to this. There might be multiple ones.
Okay.
But let's say this broke apart. Do you think it could cover 300 feet by 100 feet?
I doubt it.
And I mean, we said, and according to all witnesses, now they could have been wrong, that the ground was littered with this. So much so they had to bring, and people said they went out there and gathered this stuff up. Army personnel went up and got it. Do you think that could do that even with a bunch of these? It would seem a little unusual, wouldn't it?
Doesn't seem like so.
This is where we're going with this. Is we've mentioned the players for Roswell. We kind of mentioned what happened. We mentioned that there were some reports. So now the question is, does all that make sense? And there's been a lot of explanations by a lot of people on a lot of things. And some of them I'm not going to even get into. I'm going to get into the ones that I had problems with. Let's just try and answer those questions. And I'm not saying anybody has to believe everything I have to say. I'm asking you to consider the questions I'm asking and see what answers you come up with, and does it make sense to you? That's what we want to talk about. Okay?
Now, I also want to ask, is this something that, are there people out there that would prefer that you don't discuss these things? I mean, you obviously were pretty privy to some, some heavy duty stuff. Was there
Well,
like a time where you could say, as of this date, you could speak about things?
Some of this stuff now, because it's all come out, we could talk about this.
Okay.
Some of the other stuff that we have, that I might have over here, is stuff that people prefer we do not talk about. In fact, we've talked about stories, you and I and Larry, we've talked about stories about writing the book. And I reference to something that I have here. We can talk about this in a minute. This seemed to have caused problems in a lot of different situations. People did not want this stuff. Now, whether they believe it's not true, that's fine with me, or whether they believe it is true, but it seems to me like if it's not true, then why worry about it? But we'll get to this part, all right? So the question then becomes, what happened? What really happened? And what are the problems I have beyond any other problems that I really have?
Well, I mean, in reality, why they said that the debris was these items is beyond, I mean, we're talking about very intelligent people.
That's the question. How is it possible that a major and the base intelligence officer for the only nuclear armed force in the world at the time could not look at this and say, this is a weather balloon? Could not pick this up and say, this is a stick or this is a radar reflector, when he dealt with them almost every day? How could that be? Secondly, how could it be that his commanding officer, who was a colonel at the time, had the same problems? He couldn't identify these things. He was wrong, and he had to be told by General Ramey that, oh, you guys are all wrong. Those are just weather balloons. Does that make sense? That somebody at that rank and that level and that experience could not identify these things? I mean, doesn't make sense to me. All right. The other thing you need to know about these two men is both were promoted. Okay. Marcel became a lieutenant colonel and Blanchard became a general. Now, if anybody is familiar with the military or has been in the military, you kind of know that if you kind of screw up and embarrass the military on this big a scale worldwide, you don't typically get a promotion. They would come and be very difficult. Yet these men were promoted. When do you get promoted? You get promoted for being a good soldier and a good officer and doing what you're told. Okay? So the question becomes, how could they mistake all of this? Well, all right. How could that happen? Well, as you know from the book, I spoke with 4 men, okay, high placed in military and intelligence. One was a former captain in the United States Navy, highly placed in intelligence. He worked with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Another one was a retired colonel in the United States Air Force. He was actually an aeronautics engineer. And we like to say about Paul that if anything flew, he worked on it or he knew about it. We spoke to another guy who was a PhD. He was also a linguist, so he got involved in languages and anything odd. He would debrief POWs as well as interrogate spies. We had another one whose job was to manage secret projects, and we call them carve-out projects today.
What do you call them?
Carve-out projects. And what they are is they're a project that's being run by seemingly a public or a corporation that's really been sponsored by the United States government. They're not unusual. They also call them swine projects, which anybody who worked in them, and I worked in one of them, I don't really like the idea of swine project, but okay.
Kind of interesting.
So these people, very, very knowledgeable. There was one more guy, and he was a information specialist, data security, all that type of stuff. He knew all the information flow and that type of stuff. I spoke with them. And they had decided it was their time. They're going to tell their story. They're going to tell what they knew. And they said, listen, we're going to push the envelope, so be ready for this. And I was not ready for what happened. So again, they came up with a lot of information. And they told me what they saw in classified reports that are still secret, what, according to other people said, actually happened at Roswell. And the way they started was, and I said to them, how could those guys mistake this? And I know people like you would never make this mistake. They said they could mistake it if in fact the weather balloon or the balloon debris was mixed with debris that they had never seen before. That's how they could mistake it.
Okay, so they could have collided or something with a weather balloon or something?
In fact, what they said was, and this is all fact, that what we're talking about, that 4th of July in Roswell was a very, very stormy period of time. They're having a lot of thunderstorms, very severe thunderstorms. If you've ever been out in New Mexico or out in the plains, you can see those thunderstorms coming for 100 miles away, and they are vicious-looking storms. And they were having those that entire week there, week, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th. They're having a lot of thunderstorms out there on the plains. And there were a lot of people who reported seeing on that particular night a particularly brilliant flash at one point and a large noise. All right. So what happened? According to these men, okay, and I believe them, that this balloon, this Project Mogul balloon, was not alone in the sky that night in Roswell. That in fact, the military determined there was a craft in the sky with it, a craft that was not a terrestrial craft. And they believe that this craft was examining this balloon and setup when lightning hit the Mogul balloon because it was a radar reflector. The discharge of the electricity from the strike disrupted the electromagnetic fields in the area and caused this crash to hit the ground. It bounced off the ground. And there was some debris, but this thing was so solid that it became airborne again. This is what they believe. This is what's in the report.
Now,
and it flew off.
If I'm not mistaken, this thing made a valley in the ground.
There was a furrow in the ground, if I remember right, and again, you're going to have to check me on some of these. There's so much information, about 25 feet wide and almost 100 feet long.
That's correct.
Now, how does this do that? Okay. Now, some people would say, oh, that never happened. Okay, if it never happened, it never happened. The facts that are not in dispute from anybody is something crashed at Roswell, New Mexico in July of 1947. Nobody disputes that. The Air Force, no one. So something hit there. Now, how could it do that? According to this man, this thing hit the ground, caused a furrow, got airborne again, but crashed uprange in the mountains, just a little bit northwest of Roswell.
Which was never publicly known.
Not at the time. Not at the time.
Is there debris up in that area too?
There was debris found in that area. They found a craft. Now, some people describe the craft as crescent shape. What these men said is it was not crescent shape. Maybe the damage made it look that way, but it was actually more spherical or egg-shaped. Because, and we can talk about this in a later session, because it was determined that that is a better shape for flying through space. And there's a reason, spherical shape. That's why planets are spherically shaped. We can talk about that. Now, here's where it gets weird. If it isn't weird now...
It's been pretty weird so far.
Live in my world. Here's where it gets weird. According to some witnesses, bodies of some kind of entities were found at the second crash site. Now, for people, for many years, they have said that these were tiny 4-foot aliens.
And you brought one with you today.
And I have one with me today. But the problem is he didn't want to get out of the car because it was raining. No. 4-foot aliens that we are been told many times. You've heard of the Greys.
We call them the Greys.
The Gray aliens.
We're going to let the people know what actually we think the Greys are.
Large bulbous heads, slight bodies, about 4 to 5 feet tall, very benign features type of thing. That's what they said was fine. And many people reported this, including many people in the military, and who were subsequently told, you know, you need to keep quiet about this. And back then, when you were in the military or anywhere else, if the CIC came to you or the military said, keep quiet about this.
Was CIC?
Counterintelligence Corps.
Okay, I'm sorry.
You kept quiet about this. And those could have been some of the men in black. But you kept quiet. In fact, one person, there was a coroner who was asked if he had caskets for small bodies. They needed them on the base that night. He goes, what do you mean? And he goes, they need to be hermetically sealed. Okay, for small bodies? He went to the base, this is his story, and he was told that if he showed up there again, or he mentioned this ever again, they would find his bones in the desert. Now, this stuff did happen because the CIC was authorized to do stuff like this. That's all true. Now, whether you believe that or not, go back and really look at the history. That was true. But they said they found these small bodies, and even some of the people, some of other airmen, said they saw these as they saw them transported.
Well, there was, I believe, there was a nurse involved here.
He also heard from a nurse. Glenn Dennis was the name. The names have changed. We don't always even know what the real names were. Glenn Dennis said he spoke to a friend of his who was a nurse. She saw him when he got to the base. She says, what are you doing here? Because she was supposedly there for some of the autopsies, or whatever you want to call these aliens. Now, I want to go back. We've all seen, if you follow this stuff, the alien autopsies. They didn't look like that. They were kind of gray skinned. They were very few features. But the reality was, and we're going to kind of leave you with this, the reality was, according to these men, that the entities that they found, and they did find men, were not the real aliens. They were, in fact, biological creations, what we would call robots or probes created by an intelligent extraterrestrial life. And we're going to talk about them and how they were kind of made, and we're going to relate that to some of the things that we do today in terms of creating probes and satellites.
Absolutely. I mean, everything makes sense, and people are going to have to come back for episode 2 to find out what we are actually talking about, and we're going to get into the Greys and who they were, and there's a lot to talk about here. And of course, I know some of you are going to have some real questions about what we're doing, and there is a website I want you to go to. Not a website, but an actual email. Email us at the View Show at AOL.com, and we will try to answer you as best we can, either on the show or directly emailing back to you. I know time flies when we're having fun, and believe me, we still have so much to cover that this thing is going to go on for a while. We're gonna talk about this subject for I don't know how many episodes, but whatever it takes, we're gonna do it. And as I said in the introduction, our goal here is to eventually have a live show and have people call in live and to talk about this subject. And I'm sure, Steve, you're going to love that. That's right up your alley.
I'm just concerned about the gray that's behind the camera back there.
Oh, yeah.
I think our cameraman might be a little bit gray.
Well, he may be a little gray,
Rick,
too.
maybe you can look into that
Get a
for
little
me.
pale, isn't he?
Yeah. But,
Yeah, and we're going to talk about some of the stuff that's on the table. I mean, Scotch tape. What does that have to do with Roswell?
yeah, we have some very interesting subjects that we will get into next episode, and believe me, you will not be disappointed. Thank you for reviewing the show tonight. We want to thank Nutmeg TV for all their help and support for making this show possible, and our crew with cameraman Bill Majak and, of course, the host of the show. This program is brought to you in part by SalCal Real Estate Connections.